Welcome everybody here this evening, and it's such a pleasure to do so after so many lockdowns and lockouts for people who live interstate. It's really a treat to be able to bring people together again. And in particular, I want to welcome our guest speaker this evening, Matt Pole, who's flown in from Sydney. Thank you, Matt. This is in fact the third attempt at this lecture, so we're really happy that you're with us this evening. I also want to just acknowledge Bundjalung curator John Mundine, who's in the audience with us. Woo! John is, of course, a veteran curator who many of you would know, so welcome, John. I'd also like to welcome Kaurna Elder Uncle Lewis Yalloburka O'Brien. Thank you, Uncle Lewis, for being here. In addition, I'll acknowledge our senior university staff, Associate Professor Simone Yalalkatur, who's Pro Vice-Chancellor Indigenous here at the university. Welcome, Simone. Feels like a game show. And then Professor Peter Monteith, welcome to you as well. Peter is Vice President and Executive Dean in the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. So welcome to you all. And finally, last but not least, of course, I want to acknowledge Emeritus Professor Vincent Megaw, after whom this lecture is named. And I'll also just acknowledge his son, Jonathan, who's in the room as well. So welcome, Vincent. So my name is Fiona Salmon, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm the director here of Flinders University Museum of Art. I definitely have the best job in the university. It's an extraordinary collection of artwork that we look after here on behalf of the uni and on behalf of the nation. It's a public-facing collection. Many of you will know that we present an exhibition program through the gallery upstairs, but we're also really active in embedding the collections in teaching and learning. So that's something that we're really proud of doing, and I think particularly bringing the Indigenous collections, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collections, into a whole lot of cross-disciplinary topics, so not just the visual arts, but right across the spectrum, history, politics, law, medicine, etc. We're really, I think, making a positive impact in terms of sharing understandings and engaging students with Indigenous knowledges and perspectives. Before we get going with tonight's event, I do want to just do a little bit of housekeeping. We are still needing to observe COVID regulations, and which means that if you're not drinking, you should be in a mask. So can I encourage people to mask up if they're not drinking? In terms of fire escapes, in the unlikely event of an emergency, there is a fire escape here, and there are also two upstairs, and please follow FUMA staff in the event that we hear an alarm. So we've got Liam and Brianna and Liz upstairs. And of course, bathrooms, if you're looking for those, they're also upstairs, just near that eastern exit where you entered the building. On behalf of the university, I'd like to acknowledge that we gather this evening on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and I want to pay my respects to Kaurna elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. To welcome us to this place, it's a real privilege to invite Uncle Lewis Yalloburka O'Brien to the microphone. Thank you, Uncle.
Marawichanga, Kaurna Mina, Nai Wangani, Mani Nabundi Gani Atana. Nai Birako, Mankalakala, Tandanya, Mianaku. Nature Yungandalia, Nature Yakanandalia, Padni Adlu Wadu. On behalf of the Kaurna people, I welcome you all to Kaurna country, and I do as ambassador of the Adelaide Plains people. My brothers, my sisters, let's walk together in harmony. Natalia.
Thank you, Uncle. And I'm just going to let a little secret out of the bag. It's actually Uncle's birthday tomorrow, and he will be turning 93. Oh, sorry. So I actually lied. He's turning 92. So congratulations on behalf of us all. A national treasure, absolutely. Okay, so the annual Megaw Lecture was established in 2014 to honour the commitment and contribution of Vincent Megaw and his late wife Ruth to Flinders University Archaeology and Museum of Art. In what is now its 8th iteration, the event has enabled us to bring eminent artists, curators and academics to Adelaide to share their knowledge and engage with our community. We are grateful for the support of the Office of the Vice-Chancellor and the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences who work with FUMA to present this event. And now to say a few words on behalf of the College, I'd like to welcome Vice President and Executive Dean, Professor Peter Monteith. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and good evening, everyone. Nyadlu Tampanti Ghanamiana Yatamatanya Wama Tandanyaku. I acknowledge the Ghana people as the owners and custodians of the Adelaide Plains. It gives me great pleasure to see so many of you here this evening, especially as Fiona pointed out. We missed out on a couple of attempts at the Megaw Lecture last year, so it's great that it's been possible to stage it this year after something of a gap since the last one. The College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences is delighted to support this event. I welcome all of you, but I extend a particularly warm welcome to Matt Pole, our visitor, our guest speaker who's come over from Sydney. I welcome warmly, of course, Uncle Lewis, and congratulations in advance of your birthday tomorrow. And, of course, particularly warm welcome to Vincent Megaw. Lovely to see you here, Vincent. I would like to give just a very brief history, if I may. As Fiona said, this is an event that has something of a history. It goes back to 2014. It's an event that honours the contribution of esteemed Flinders academics Vincent Megaw, now Emeritus Professor Vincent Megaw, and his late wife, Dr Ruth Megaw. Many of you, I'm sure, will be aware that Vincent is a man of many parts. He studied archaeology at the University of Edinburgh and later developed his fascination with early Celtic art. I was trying to think in the spirit of Vincent of a way of summarising pithily a long and distinguished career, and I thought I might say that his life in ruins as an archaeologist morphed into a life in runes in his expertise in Celtic art, with apologies there to Vincent for an awful pun. Vincent's late wife, Ruth Megaw, was just as multifaceted in her interests, perhaps even more so than Vincent, as she reinvented herself many times over a long and distinguished career until her death in 2013. They were married in the year I was born, and that gives you a clue that that was a very long time ago. And together, they produced something in the order of 300 scholarly articles, more than a dozen books, and a son, Jonathan, whom I also welcome here this evening. I knew both Ruth and Vincent when I was first at Flinders University back in the 1990s. I thought of them then, as I still do now, as Flinders' first and perhaps only power couple. The university has many reasons to feel deeply indebted to both of them, but in particular for the part they have played in building the collection of Indigenous art here in FUMA, truly a collection of national and indeed international significance. So the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences is proud of our leadership in research and teaching in archaeology, in Indigenous studies, in the creative arts, and we're very aware that in what we do in these areas, we stand on the very broad shoulders of Vincent and Ruth Megaw. Personally, I'm very pleased that Vincent is still very much a presence in the college, and it's a pleasure to have him here for this year's iteration of the annual Megaw Lecture. And it's completely appropriate, of course, that it's on a topic that brings together archaeology and the visual arts. So thanks again to all of you for being here, and I'll hand back to Fiona to introduce our speaker for this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, now turning to tonight's lecture, I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Matt Pole. Matt grew up on Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales and is of Torres Strait Islander and South Sea Islander descent. Matt has worked in museums and art galleries for nearly 20 years and is currently completing a master's degree researching the ways contemporary Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists have used archival and museum collections in the reconstruction of cultural identities. In 2005, he was appointed Artistic Director at Bumali Aboriginal Artists Collective, an organisation that creates and supports opportunities for Aboriginal artists in New South Wales in particular from regional and remote areas. In 2009, Matt joined what was then known as the Macleay Museum and today as the Chow Chuck Wing Museum at the University of Sydney. While there, he was Assistant Curator of the Indigenous Heritage Collections and the university's repatriation, and he worked as the university's repatriation project officer. He has been involved with the development of many major exhibitions, including most recently Ambassadors and Gululu, Duwala, Jalkari, Welcome to the Yolngu Foundations. In 2021, Matt was recruited to the Australian National Maritime Museum, where he is now the manager of Indigenous programs. In this role, his work continues to focus on aspects around collections development, in particular Indigenous communities' desires of how they want to see themselves today and into the future. A key part of this work focuses on the importance of using digital platforms to create social spaces for conversations about collections management and exhibitions development. Matt's international research collaborations include the 2014 Howard Mitchell Fellowship and curatorial residency at the Musée de Quai Branly in France. In 2016, he was a member of the Australia Council for the Arts First Nations curatorial delegation to the United States, and in 2018, a collections consultant for the National Museum of Finland. In addition to his role at the National Maritime Museum, he is also chairperson of Orana Arts, an arts and culture support agency for individual and organisations in regional and remote New South Wales. He's a member of the Indigenous Advisory Board for the Sydney Museum of Contemporary Art, and he's also been a long-term member of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Collection Management Reference Group at Sydney's Museum of Arts and Applied Sciences. Matt has published widely on Aboriginal art from southeastern Australia and northeast Arnhem Land, and he's contributed to important debates around representation, the nature of Indigenous participatory engagement, and cultural democracy in museum contexts. Please make him welcome. Thank you, Matt.
Is that microphone working okay? Yeah. Thank you so much, Fiona, for that incredible introduction. I forget myself sometimes some of the stuff you get involved in working in the arts. Yeah, sure. Hopefully, is that any better? Sorry. I'd just like to begin tonight's proceeding by acknowledging the Kaurna people whose lands we're assembled on here tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the Yolngu people and many, many other nations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who I've been incredibly fortunate to work with over a number of years now. An acknowledgement of country is a political statement. It's not something you take lighthearted. It's an acknowledgement of the deep, profound connection to country and how so much of that law and history was overwritten by the colonial enterprise. And I think it's up to all of us to take that chance wherever we can to acknowledge and reaffirm Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's connection to country and their deep and profound love of country. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, I grew up in Byron Bay in northern New South Wales. Please don't hold that show Byron Bay's on Netflix against me. It's an atrocious representation of the quite beautiful area there. This is my family, my grandmother actually in 1930s. If you're familiar with it all with Wadigo's Beach these days, this is their old farmhouse in the bottom here. Very, very different these days. Last time I went, I couldn't even get a parking spot there. So it shows you how much the place has changed and how important it is that we actually recognise our connection to country and, preserve and cherish those connections and the histories which are there. So look, I hope I don't jump too much between time periods, between places, between knowledges, between spaces. It's an incredibly varied work that I've been just so profoundly lucky to be involved in with over a number of years now. This talk actually was supposed to happen, as we said, 2020, after the opening of the Chowchak Wing Museum, which was a consolidation of the Macleay Museum, a natural history and cultural anthropology museum, which I worked at for around 9 years. The Nicholson Museum, which our namesake for tonight's speaker series had a profound influence on for about a decade or so, and the University of Sydney Art Collection. And it was around a 10-year process, I guess, since the very first rumours I heard of this big new project that was being developed. And as Fiona was speaking to me earlier and stuff, it is a really important template for university museums in general. We see amazing work done by our state and national museum institutions, but it's actually the hard work of academic museums such as where we're gathered tonight and the university museum sector in general, who really train the next generation of arts workers. We had a visitor today, Tina Baum, the collections manager at the National Gallery of Australia, and all we were talking about is there's all these new projects happening. There's the big Art Gallery of New South Wales. There's Lot 14 happening here in Adelaide. There's Alice Springs has got a new Aboriginal art museum being proposed. But where's the staff? Where's the investment in infrastructure in our cultural communities? We have around 70 remote art centres around the northern end of the country that are screaming out for resources and help as well. When we look at the contribution that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people generously make towards Australia's cultural reputation on the world stage, it's actually quite astounding how that we don't resource and respect and properly allocate the type of energy that we need to our art sector. I mean, our art sector has had 10% cuts for more than a decade. When you look at it at the federal level, all of our national institutions are screaming for support. We've had the recent floods in Lismore, which have just taken a regional art gallery off the map, essentially. The libraries associated as well. If there was ever a time in our recent history where we needed to really respect and challenge what we contribute to our artistic community, I think now more than ever is where that's so crucial. So the Chowchak Wing Museum, and I just wanted to go through a little bit of this background of the Ambassadors exhibition and the process we did, especially in relation to the Lot 14 project that I was just walking past this morning actually, because there was some great sort of ideas that we were able to sort of learn from communities themselves about the way that we build that community voice and that community, their respect for community into not just the exhibitions, but actually into the architectural fabric of the building itself. One of the things that I'm just most proud of for the work that I've done with the university's was the University of Sydney Repatriation Project. The University of Sydney had a deep connection to most medical schools in Australia. It was a deep connection to the coroners' courts all around Australia as well. We had a substantial collection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ancestral remains, and to be a part of some of those returns to country of the ancestral remains, which were held in our museum collections and registered with museum numbers, and to actually deaccession those and literally hand them over to communities is probably one of the most important work that I've ever done. But learning from community about that process of repatriation is where we were able to sort of build that, build expectations of what community wanted to do. I mean, for a long time in Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people weren't welcome in our state museums and institutions. And this was an opportunity to flip that narrative and to actually build the type of space where the community could walk in and say, I was involved in the conversations in this place. So smoking ceremonies, which are an integral part of the handover process during repatriation, was also an important part of the actual design of the space. We see so many stories in other institutions and things where sometimes people are doing smoking ceremonies out in the car park. We're not valuing the importance of a smoking ceremony and the cleansing that brings. We were able to, because we were actually decommissioning older museums, we were able to smoke those museums and sort of smoke the new spaces inside the new museum where collections were being brought into in any way that we could to reassure those objects, which we spoke of as ancestors. They are made by the hands of ancestors. I work with a lot of historical collections from the old anthropology department and ethnographic collections. So we sort of treated them. That's why the exhibition was called Ambassadors. We wanted to treat that presence of the hand of the ancestors and give them that dignity and the respect that they were due. We initiated through our conversations with the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, which is the main authority in Sydney, a new process where the ashes from different smoking ceremonies were kept and added to as more smoking ceremonies happened, and little bits of the ashes from the past ceremonies were used in the new ceremonies that took place in the bowls. Little things like that made a huge difference in terms of the building itself being welcoming. There were plenty of other conversations that went place. This choice of sandstone colours reflects Sydney as parts of Sydney were huge sandstone quarries. When we look at the different areas, the buildings on Macquarie Street, or the most significant building on our campus at the University of Sydney, they're called sandstone universities because they are literally dug up from Aboriginal land and transformed into these entities which we think of today. But there are also really simple ways. There was a big infrastructure push on campus, so there was several buildings taking place, and we initiated this project called the Wingaramura Architectural Infrastructure Strategy. And from conversations with a couple of the Sydney elders, they talked to us about Darman, the fig trees, which are planted all around the parks in our Sydneys and in the botanic gardens and different places like that. And so a simple thing that I was so impressed to see the architects return with was this idea of the dappled light coming through the Port Jackson fig trees, Darman in the Gadigal language, and sort of reiterate it into this light box, the ceiling of the space. Past museums are a bit, like labyrinths to enter, and unwelcoming as well. So it was to the idea of that light-filled space, something where you could walk into it and sort of not feel that you're being pressured or guided or, pushed into a different way. Light was an important part of the other discussions as well. Bringing these objects to light through proper consultation and not just hiding them in dusty shelves and hiding things behind the wall of it's too hard to do consultations or it's too expensive to do this or that. So, simple conversations over many years and, following on from conversations from things that had happened at repatriation ceremonies and many, many other consultations, guided the way that the empty building itself, which was also entirely smoked before any object went inside to the storerooms or into the exhibition spaces too, was a really central philosophy that I felt really proud to witness and be a small part of. So the other challenge was the Macleay collections that I worked with for a number of years sometimes come to us from really problematic contexts. Working as a repatriation project officer, for example, we had returned cultural materials which had been picked up from a massacre, for example. There was no legal way that the museum could own these objects these days. And you know, it's not enough, even under our current laws, to say, because something is unprovenanced, we don't know. If you don't know, you shouldn't really legally be able to own these objects. So out of around 6,000 objects that I've worked with for a number of years, the real challenge, and believe me, I got a lot of pushback from different community members. You know, I had an exhibitions team who was, why aren't we showcasing all these treasures? And it's like, well, why are we calling them treasures? You know, why aren't we calling them in the language names of the makers? And so another sort of philosophy was, what hadn't worked in other exhibitions that I'd seen was, with these historical materials, grouping them all in the one room and in the one space. It was a subtle echo of the mission and reserve era of taking people from many nations and pushing them into one space, you know, and having tiwi objects next to, you know, Bundjalung objects or Yolngu objects, and sort of not giving the object itself the agency to breathe and the object itself to actually be arranged and assembled and exhibited in a way that community members would read them. So at the end of the day, there wasn't just one exhibition space in the new museum, and there was also 17 other exhibitions which were part of the inauguration of the new Chao Chak Wing Museum. It was an opportunity to, I decided not to go with one room of, you know, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander galleries, and to actually intersect 8 separate exhibition cases through all 4 floors of the museum. And this one is actually the index in the foyer. So there's an object from each of those 8 cases. It's called the Gadigal Codex. This is one of the earliest photos of Aboriginal people in the Sydney region, the Gundungurra people from 1859, which we held in our collection as well. And it's a double-sided case that you see in our events room and in the foyer of the museum. And these Gundungurra elders, through consultation, the community member I spoke to, I mean, it's a really small 10 by 10 centimetre photo. When we actually blew it up, we realised he was wearing a government blanket from the Native Institute in Penrith in New South Wales. He's overseeing objects from Bardi country, from Wiradjuri country, from Iwaja country, and a stone tool from the Castlereagh region in Sydney, as well as on the other side you can see objects from Queensland, West Australia and Tiwi too. But so each case itself is in dialogue and conversation, in some cases actually inserted into the middle of other exhibitions that were taking place throughout the museum space. And I think parts of it worked really well. The other challenge, we were supposed to open just a couple of months after March 2020. So there was a different way, I'll get into this also extra. The consultation I did was with remote art centres predominantly. I mean, they are the front doors of any community that you'd like to engage with. And we wanted community members to come down and sort of activate each of the exhibition spaces, but that certainly wasn't possible throughout 2020. And so it was a really disappointment that it was such an underwhelming non-event, essentially, when we did finally open the museum space. But this is the Tiwi assemblage here. And on the left, you can see the Iwaja assemblage. And there's a deep historical connection between the Tiwi and Iwaja, which is in Coburg Peninsula, just north of Darwin. That's one of the earliest bark paintings, which I'm sort of slowly getting up to our topic for tonight's talk. But, you know, I learned so much. So there's essentially in ambassadors, there was 100 objects which sort of, through community consultation, made the final exhibition, representing 25 different language groups from all around the country. And community members were actively involved in arranging the objects inside the display case, and the only other condition that we put on top of that selection process was that objects had to be named in as close as possible to the language words of the makers of those objects, or at least in the language regions where they were attributed and provenanced from today. So you can see here how this exhibition Vampapia of Wik peoples objects from Western Cape York were inserted into our classical antiquities galleries, which did get a little bit of pushback from different sorts of people. It was a hard concept to fight for until we actually got it installed. I'd also worked on a different project, which was a real testing ground for this process. So in 2015, I did a project about Aboriginal stone tools, which were in our collections. We have some of the earliest museum collections of stone tools in Australia, the Macleay bequest, which was tools acquired before 1891. But not being an archaeologist and not having any sort of expertise in that area, other than realising that they were beautiful, crafted pieces of stone, and as one elder told me, fragments of Aboriginal land. The curatorial choice I took with that project was not to group them by archaeology type, but to group them by language nation, and to actually start to see these connections and trade routes from right up in northwestern Australia to central Australia, or from Victoria into New South Wales and vice versa. Sometimes you can see quarries where particular stone tools are quarried, essentially, and find them in 20 other language nations in the path from where that quarry is. You know, they are essentially toolkits. So that idea of removing the English classification for objects, in this case stone tools, and just replacing it by grouping them in the closest thing as possible to the modern nations map that we have today. And, you know, try and reassert language names to it. I mean, when you think of how utilitarian and functional so many of our names, like, you know, spear thrower, of course you'd use woomera instead of spear thrower. It's just a much more beautiful word. There's so many other examples where the functional way that we've typologized museum objects robs them of this agency, and the simple act of just renaming them in the language of the speaker was... you know, it's a simple curatorial choice. I've said this plenty of times, but, you know, I've probably got the easiest job as a curator because I let collections curate themselves, and I'll show that a little bit more when I get into the Yolnu collections that I worked with. And so each case had an ambassador who was my primary consultation person. I was incredibly fortunate to work with Tina Baum from the National Gallery of Australia, who was a Larrakia woman herself and Waterman, who worked with this incredible range of objects from 1872. And you can start to see where the origins of bark painting in itself. One of the things I just wanted to get across with tonight's lecture is we think of Yolnu and bark painting, but there are actually many origins of the idea of painting on bark. And of course the Yolnu are the grand masters of that concept these days, and pretty well the owners of bark painting as such. But we can point to several other places, not only in the Northern Territory, but in other parts of the country, in this beautiful 1872 model of a watercraft from the Port Darwin region at the time, Palmerston at the time. You can see it's actually beautifully painted in ochre. And so looking for these origin points where painting exists, whether it's not just on painting on bodies or painting on rock art, painting of artefacts. You know, we've seen plenty of axes that are painted, for example. We have Tiwi objects where they were painted. Was where you know, the ambassadors for each of those exhibition cases really guided the choice in how we actually displayed the items and, you know, let the items speak their own truth. Because you can also look to other places outside Yolnu country, the Jar Jar Waring barks, for example, which have been exhibited in Australia and were the reason for the recent peak hole laws of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members not being able to put requests for repatriation on objects which are in touring exhibitions. So these were acquired around 1850s in the Jar Jar Waring region of Victoria, for example. I mean, they're not painting as such, they're held over a fire and used in ceremonial contexts, and then they're etched back into them, these amazing figures and different things. They sparked controversy when they were first exhibited in Victoria in the 1990s, and of all people, Gary Foley was the curator working at the Melbourne Museum who organised a protest and literally tried to return them to the true owners of those objects as such. And interestingly, only one of them came out in the Encounters exhibition from the British Museum in 2016 as well. But you get to sense that what I'm trying to set up is the way that bark painting as we know it is only one form of visual communication, and the idea of using bark as a medium and a communicative tool exists in all sorts of formats. And it's reached its synthesis in painting, I guess, but there are incredible ways that we can actually point to many other parts of the country, not just Yolngu people, but where, one of the most sustainable artistic methods in the world today, I would argue, you're actually using parts of a tree to represent the landscape. You're using ochres from the ground to depict parts of that landscape, yellows from here, oranges from there, greys from down near the riverbank. The way that some bark paintings are actually diagrammatic maps of the country that they are depicting, not just literally, but spiritually, is one of the most sophisticated art methods that I could think of. And I love being able to actually challenge, especially international audiences who sometimes ask, why is it so important? Once you actually break it down, the different elements of this incredibly sustainable practice. I mean, they're not using oil paints made of petrochemicals, for example. They are using the earth itself to depict the earth. And you can't really see, I can't think of a better example of that process than what we've seen in bark paintings in Australia. I should have given a warning at the start that some of these pictures are of deceased people. But I just wanted to go into the backstory of the 1946 bark paintings that I worked with, because I was incredibly fortunate. The Macleay Museum is largely the collections of 3 generations of the Macleay family in Sydney. Alexander Macleay was the colonial secretary in 1823, and he was also the trustee, one of the founding members of the Australian Museum, and he was president of the Linnaean Society of New South Wales as well, which is the study of natural history, where there are actually profound resources in terms of exploring contact zone knowledges and interactions between First Nations Australians of many nations, and the way that their knowledges were actually brought into scientific papers at the time and transmitted all around the world. But the first bark paintings that exist in there are earlier examples in the British Museum. So I'm talking about bark paintings in Australian museums. The earliest bark paintings in any Australian museum are the Port Essington or the Awaja people's bark paintings of 1872, which were acquired by Alexander Cox, who was a conchologist, a shell collector. They're quite interesting, the way that natural history collectors collecting birds, fish, reptiles, all sorts of things used Aboriginal knowledges, and they used Aboriginal guides to actually, harvest and collect different types of specimens for natural history museums all around the world. There's been some great research done by Lynette Russell and different people of the unpaid and unrecognised role that Aboriginal people played in natural history specimen collections. And because these were presented to the Linnaean Society of New South Wales and they all depict animals, it was quite likely that they were only acquired as an example of native drawings as such, and native drawings of animals, to see the way that, to use that term, Aboriginal people in the Port Essington region depicted the natural world. And you also need to remember with these, they were part of larger shelters, wet season shelters, so they're actually chopped down to be transported easier. This idea of the shape of a bark painting today being something that's easily transportable and sold is a little bit of a negotiation with the modern world. It's important not to think of these artefacts as pristine artefacts. They were just sort of plucked up off the ground, and there's no agency of the people in there in terms of making them. Many of these people made things willingly to trade with people too. Many of them didn't, and that's a different discussion about what should be repatriated and what shouldn't. But it's the most important thing with any museum collection is to have that conversation and to be open and willing to accept what that conversation means. So when you actually look at the drawings in the original Linnaean Society paper, you can see how fortunate we are that these examples, which are more than 130 years old, I would say now, have held up over time. And because of the light conditions in the new museum and things like that, we can only really show one at a time. But there's a rotating roster. And the incredible thing, I'll go to a little bit later, but I volunteered with Anchor, and I couldn't find any Awaja community members that wanted to talk to me about bark paintings until I was just in Darwin after the Darwin Art Fair, and I met an Awaja artist, a descendant of Paddy Compass Namet Barra, one of the most significant Aboriginal bark paintings of the 1960s. Like, this man's son was actually named Namet Barra. And yeah, he guided me towards all this knowledge that I didn't know, and gave me, the permission to. And he was actually shocked. He didn't know the existence of these paintings. He didn't know the remarkable story of his ancestor, Paddy Compass, who I was able to share. Consultation is always a two-way street. It's not about being, a researcher and just going and taking information. If you're not giving back the information that you're learning and seeking in a format that is acceptable to community members, it's not ethical research. And they're a remarkable snapshot of the ecologies of that region at the time. Luckily, Port Essington isn't as overdeveloped as other parts of the country. When you look at the historical records of places like Sydney, they were much more pristine, before the pollutions and things happened. All of our landscapes, which we take for granted today, like Adelaide as well, had surprisingly larger amounts of biodiversity than they do today, which is pretty obvious. But you can start to see there's interesting ways that contemporary art worked with this as well. So because there was so many of these bark wet season shelters that were destroyed during the colonisation process, there was not that many examples in existence today. And this is where contemporary artists have a really important responsibility, because it's not about just replicating historical knowledge as it exists in museum collections. That's not actually the way to do. When you talk and work with community members, they need to have that permission from their peers and their community members to represent these knowledge in public formats. So there's really interesting opportunities when we're doing consultations where sometimes artists come back with these amazing representations of what is thought to be historical knowledge, but that knowledge was actually constructed by anthropologists or archaeologists or different people throughout history. So it's not a matter of just seeking out historical source material and replicating it. It's about speaking to it. There's really great examples of artists like Christian Thompson, for example, who investigates historical collections, but he doesn't represent them. He represents his subjective response to those objects through his self-portraiture. So hopefully that's not too abstract, but the way that some artists are replicating the past can have really dangerous implications for contemporary community members when they're replicating stereotypes which were constructed by non-Indigenous agency, I guess is what I was trying to say. I'll try to go a bit quicker, because another interesting precedent is the artists who were imprisoned in Fanny Bay Jail in 1888, and it's quite a strange place when you go visit, and you can see these replications of these drawings as they were. It's one of the first exhibitions of Aboriginal art, and it was an exhibition of bark paintings which was held in Melbourne in 1888, called The Dawn of Art. And there's quite interesting similarities in the way that the depictions of some of the subject matter of these drawings is replicated in bark paintings and in other sort of historical records of the time, of the way that people were using designs on body painting, for example. These are some of the replications from the reproductions which are on display in Fanny Bay Jail. Fanny Bay Jail has all sorts of horrible implications for the people of the Northern Territory as well. Places like Darwin, where people from many, many nations were forced into the reserves and the prisons up there, essentially. So when we talk about the historical community of Darwin, we also need to be careful about the way that people have multiple connections to many other nations in the surrounding areas. And just lastly, in relation to this is Don Christopherson, another Awaja man who I met during my consultation on the Port Essington bark paintings. And he did this amazing project I saw last year of an Aboriginal stockman who was sentenced to death at Fanny Bay Jail. And this is just a snapshot. No different to other 19th century drawings. There's a few artists that we know of, like Nicky of Valadola and different sort of people like that. But this was a pretty well unheard of 19th century artist who was quite sophisticated and was involved in some of the first, he was with some of the first non-Indigenous people to really re-territorialise those parts. And he got into an altercation with a landowner and was sentenced to death because he shot that landowner. And I can point you toward it after if you like, but it's a project that's being undertaken by the Darwin Library, the Library of the Northern Territory. And I'd really like to see so much more work done on this, because this agency of 19th century Aboriginal artists is the substrata, the groundwork of where so much of our 20th century Aboriginal art, the idea of Aboriginal art, came from, I think. So, sorry for that roundabout way, and let me know if I'm running out of time or anything. You know, the construction of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander past is something that Ambassadors was all about breaking down. Yet it was an important thing to do at somewhere like the University of Sydney. I mean, the University of Sydney Anthropology Department trained students who went on to implement the policies of the stolen generations and the architects of the assimilation era, for example. You know, even today, all of our universities train lawyers who go out to fight and argue against native title cases. Universities are not neutral in the same way that museums are not neutral. And it's important to really give, to be honest about that, in terms of, you know, we can't just be cheerleaders as for Aboriginal arts without actually listening to the criticisms that community members want to tell us and need to tell us, you know, and we deserve to respect them telling us that. So in relation to Yolngu art, probably what I'll focus on here is just the way that this idea of Yolngu bark painting is actually a public voice from a much deeper historical background. The Australian, and I'm jumping a little bit between time periods here. That last image was from 1940 from Walkabout magazine, a fascinating resource if you have got time. I think a lot of it's up on Trove now. It's incredible. You don't often, you know, as a researcher, things aren't categorised in the way that you would like them to, you know, and that's another thing that we need to do with our archives is provide entry points so that someone who's a Wiradjuri person doing Wiradjuri history can just type in Wiradjuri and find those sources of information across, because things get hidden in archives. That's one of the main things that people say. But this construction of Aboriginal art can also be traced to a really important exhibition in Sydney in 1949. Aboriginal Art and Its Decorative Applications by David Jones Gallery. A lot of ethnographic objects were used in that exhibition, but around 80% of the people who participated in the exhibition were non-Indigenous artists. And this is where you get that the beginning of Aboriginalia, for example. That amazing work that Tony Albert does, for example, repurposing things from the 40s, 50s and 60s with those depictions of Aboriginal people and returning the gaze to that historical era by reassembling it in ways that are far more critical of the overt racist stereotyping which is being depicted on a lot of those craft objects. People like Margaret Preston are quite complex in that sort of ways. On the one hand, at the time, they're trying to champion Aboriginal culture, but they're also appropriating artistic palettes, artistic motifs. They're mixing up things. They're replicating that mistake of pushing things into missions and reserves by just appropriating for the purpose of aesthetics. And so this is where museums, more so than art galleries, have a much more active role in the construction of this modern idea of 20th century Aboriginal art that we have today. The Melbourne Museum, for example, with Baldwin Spencer, collecting some of the first bark paintings from Owen Pelly in 1912. The South Australian Museum here, which I have to admit is one of my guilty pleasures in terms of how encyclopedic it is in terms of that historical source material of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander past. And also just needs to be better resourced to employ more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from the many nations that it represents and holds. So I work in museums. I don't want to destroy the spaces that I rely on, but also it's the outcomes from better consultation and better ethical research are better for everybody. They're not just better for museums. And any outcome that's better for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members is the best type of atonement for the stereotypes and mistakes of the past that were made. So the way that the media played a role in the construction of Aboriginal art is quite interesting as well. I love this headline, this weird Aboriginal art. This is one of the first articles describing Ronald and Catherine Burnt's 2-year research project in Yirrkala in 1946-47, right after World War II. It was funded by the Australian Research Council. It was actually, Charles Mountford was about to work with the National Geographic Society, and Elkin hated Mountford, and so Elkin sent Ronald and Catherine up to work in Yirrkala to gazump him, basically. And if you've seen the Yirrkala drawings held by the Burnt Museum, for example, there's a really beautiful story that's sort of unfolding there, and I'll get into that a little bit more with the embargo on the Burnt records in a minute. But I'm just trying to show some of the ways that this idea of Aboriginal sculpture, for example, was portrayed in the media as, just new, as if Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would have sculpture, for example, carvings in the round. But I did a lot of this sort of research in another ARC project called Performance and Assimilation in Australian museums. And was quite one of my heroes from that sort of research that we did is this lady, Dorothy Bennett, who is purported to have had Wiradjuri ancestry herself. She worked with Stuart Scougal as an assistant. He was a dentist. And even though Scougal donated some of the first tiwi poles to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, for example, it was Dorothy that spent 30 years really championing the industry of Aboriginal art as such. On Art Safari with a Rifle, this is from Women's Weekly magazine in the 1960s. There's, especially in that mid-20th century period, there's some Indigenous and non-Indigenous people whose work is really unrecognised today, I found. My work working with the Yirrkala bark paintings from 1946-47. The way that some of these people used bark painting exhibitions in embassies all around the world, for example. I think researchers like Dr Murray Geisler, have done work where they've shown there's been about 40 exhibitions held in embassies between 1930 and 1970 all around the world. That's why I talk about bark paintings as ambassadors. This is a time when Aboriginal people themselves had to request permission to move interstate and places like that. But bark paintings and assemblages of bark paintings were conduits for for the type of knowledge that Aboriginal people wanted to share on the world stage. So in 1963, there was an amazing performance which was associated with the bark painting exhibition that Dorothy Bennett had put together. And you can think of this exhibition as a great counterpoint to the 1949 David Jones exhibition, for example, because there was 40 artists in the exhibition that she put together, around 260 works. Corroboree itself was a pretty interesting performance by the Australian Ballet Company. It's entirely non-Indigenous staff, performers who were performing an Aboriginal boys' initiation ceremony. It's historical, it's of its moment, you could say, in being generous. But the art exhibition, which was associated with bringing later versions of Corroboree, and there actually was a performance of Corroboree done by Bangarra in 2008, which was all Aboriginal performers. As shows you hopefully how much we've actually come since then. I'm really jumping through it tonight because of the time constraints, and so this article is actually coming out in the Aboriginal History Journal in the next issue. So that's what I'm basing some of these images from, and hopefully if you can track that down, you can read it in a lot more coherent way than I'm jumping across tonight. Because that brings me to one little treasure that came out of that 1963 research in relation to our namesake tonight. Vincent worked at the Nicholson Museum, which was the counterpart to the Macleay Museum that I worked at. You have a much more interesting story. I might give you the microphone afterwards about this newspaper article. So once again, the media jumping to their own representation of things. But the Nicholson Museum had its own smaller collection, which later became absorbed into, like this isn't an Aboriginal axe, as far as I'm aware. No.
From Scandinavia.
Yeah, of course. But yeah, like the way that they're representing the Stone Age culture at this time, there's some interesting parallels away, because what really interested me with that period of University of Sydney was the way that bark paintings, if I'm right, these were ones that you had purchased from Dorothy Bennett, and this is a really common practice from the University of Sydney in terms of putting together assemblages of objects and exchanging them with museums all around the world. When we were doing the research for our bark painting exhibition, to come across these works from Moscard Museum and to sort of trace them back to Sydney to that exhibition in 1963, for example, just shows you how far Aboriginal collections have gone. I mean, there's not many museums in the world that don't have an Aboriginal stone tool in them. There's quite a lot that have Aboriginal material culture, and there's an increasing amount of museums that have Aboriginal art in them. And it's important to really encourage this international recognition of Aboriginal art, because that's not stuff that's been collected in the field as such by researchers. It's stuff that Aboriginal people have produced with their own agency. And the more contemporary Aboriginal art that that museums can facilitate into international exhibitions is part of that process of giving more agency to Aboriginal people themselves, rather than reconstructing their past for them. These are just some more examples of exhibitions that Dorothy took to Japan and America. She actually got in trouble because she was giving so much money to the Aboriginal artists. You know, the Native Affairs boards, for example, were always on her case about, why are you giving so much money back to putting cash into the hands of some of the poorest people in the country? It sounds crazy, but, Aboriginal people's lives were so controlled at that time. And just a different connection back to that international engager. So Paddy Compass, Nemit Barra, along with Yirawala, along with that sort of first generations of Aboriginal artists who really demonstrated their own authority and agency as ambassadors for Aboriginal culture, and specifically Yolngu culture on the world stage, exist in all sorts of ways. This is one of my favourite installations from the Pompidou Museum, for example, and you can see the Paddy Compass Nemit Barra on the left side. There's also a box full of boomerangs. There's a couple of clubs and a few stone tools, I think, are from Australia as well. These are all provided by Carol Kupka, one of the more interesting and one of my sort of favourite collectors of that time period, because he was introducing European audiences to the idea of Aboriginal agency, and also recording the songs and language in a way that a lot of non-Indigenous collectors at the time weren't that interested in. This is his exhibition from the Museum of Asia, Oceania and Africana. Kebran Lee was an amazing example of the type of way museums are going. It was the Museum of Mankind and the Museum of Asia, Oceania and Africana, and in 2007 it was reassembled into the Museum of Civilization. The French really led the way there in a sense in terms of giving agency back to the makers of objects and exhibiting objects in the contexts outside of scientific discourse, for example. But we can't forget what's going on here in the 1960s as well. So in the 1963, we have the bark petitions. We have so many examples of especially Yolngu people standing up for themselves, setting the groundwork for what would later become known as the land rights movement, and using art as a vehicle to not only record their encyclopedic knowledge of their own culture, but to be artists themselves in the way that they're using their knowledges, which is incredibly far more profound than the way it was written in Australian history books in the 1960s. To get onto the exhibition project that I worked on, one of the amazing legacies that I was sort of really fortunate to come across through my work at the Macleay Museum was Wanjak Marika, Wiradjingu leader of his time. He was the first Aboriginal chair of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Arts Board. He was actually there in 1946-47 when Ronald and Catherine burnt. He was 14 years old at the time, and he was one of the few people who spoke English and helped them interpret so many of the paintings for the records that were made. And we were incredibly lucky to have hours of recordings of him talking about the 96 paintings that we worked with in the Macleay Museum. And they were pretty well the curatorial guideline for the consultation process that I took up to Yirrkala in 2018 and 2019. You can recognise some of these works later on in the way that they're exhibited in the Chowchak Wing Museum exhibition, Chalkari. Another amazing person who incredibly generously gave us guidance in the early stages of the big Yolnu exhibition that we worked on was Dr. Joseph Nyampara Gumbula. In 2009, he did an amazing exhibition at the Macleay Museum called Makagama. Everything is telling us who we are. Such a simple but profound way of thinking about not just culture, but about our role and the responsibilities we have to the lands that we live on. His exhibition and his honorary doctorate for the University of Sydney for ethnomusicology was a real turning point for the university, I think, to counteract the way that for more than 80, 90 years, the University of Sydney had, harvested and mined almost Yolnu and Aboriginal people's knowledges and, trained an entire generation of non-Indigenous, scholars, anthropologists, and set the starting point for the new era that we're living in now. And so it's an important way to sort of not forget the past, but to bookend it a little bit and to sort of look to some of these moments, this was 2009, and to build on them in the way that new exhibitions are designed. So I didn't know John was going to be here tonight, so I've seen a few of my photos. John was actually incredibly integral to the consultation process. Even though we didn't pay him as much as we could have, and that was a constant cause of angst for me in terms of how generous John Mundine, who's in the audience tonight, for anyone who doesn't know, incredible mentor to myself and many other people over many years. I first met John when I worked at Wollongong Gallery in 1998, and his generosity over the years has just been profound. I actually just wanted to show you, I have this okay, John. So the university itself had worked so much with Yolnu people's music, their art, their knowledges of their kinship. If anyone is familiar with anthropology, the stuff that you see in your textbooks usually comes from, research that's been taken. Not just Aboriginal people, Yolnu people are some of the most researched people in the world in that sort of sense. And the way that their knowledges are often represented without their participation, almost what I'm doing tonight, can really make you stop and think about how important it is to not just engage through art centres and the commercial art world and the material that artists are wanting to put out there, but look for a way to represent that story in a way that gives the power back to the community members. So these are various stages. The other big part of the Chalkari exhibition I worked with was the Ramingining collection, one of several collections that John put together in the 1980s when he was the arts manager of Bulla Arts Centre in Ramingining. And I'll go through some of these a little bit. But this is the region that we're representing in this exhibition. Once you start to break it down, you can realise it's many, many different knowledges. Not being a Yolnu speaker, I was taken to task by community members, and they was entirely right. I took it on the chin. I was almost, it'd be like me curating an exhibition of French artists and not speaking French. There's a real space to be created there for language speakers to be actively involved in the curatorial choice. We can say that we facilitated that as much as possible, but when you're working even across three quite distinct communities in Yolngu country in northeast Arnhem Land, the protocols and the mistakes that you can make jumping between those different places and pushing them into an exhibition space can have serious consequences for the community members that you're working with. If you misrepresent their knowledge in a way that makes them look bad to other community members, you're causing damage. And that's exactly the last thing that you want to do as a curator, but it's something that you need to be really mindful of, and something that I've learned a lot in just a very, very short amount of time. And we'll always be learning, because there is no end point on that type of knowledge to an outsider like myself. I'll come back to that one. This is just a John first came back to Hammond meeting. Curator is the hell out of my life. I've been working for many years. They knew John's name, even though they'd never met him. It's like a really amazing experience just to walk around the community. See John's memories of that place. Some things have changed a lot. Some things haven't changed. But to just sit and be a curator in this museum, curating these objects that were acquired by John in 1984 or something. Power, because it's just reinforced to me how important it was to actually just involve the makers. Sometimes as curators we stand a bit abstractly outside ourselves. This is Rebecca Conway, who is a very significant person who co-edited the book, edited the book, Corroboree, as well as the exhibition process. And yeah, it's just it's the best thing that I've ever filmed. Like, so sorry, John, I just had to show it. So that was part of the process. I'm not sure how we're going for time. So how much long? Do you want me to go for 10? Okay, look, I'll just really quickly wrap it up. The historical material we were working from was incredibly, deep. A lot of the artists who put together that bark painting assemblage in 46, 47 worked as coast watchers for the army at the time. One man, Narajan Maimuru, was actually on the boat, the Patricia Cam, when it was bombed by the Japanese in 1943 off the Wessel Islands. There was a minister, the Reverend Leonard Kentish, who was on the Patricia Cam, and he was taken prisoner of war by the Japanese and beheaded on Dobu Island off the coast of Papua New Guinea in 1943. So much of what we know about World War II was deliberately hidden for many decades and has only really came to light in recent years. But one of the heroes of the Patricia Cam bombing, which happened, was Narajan Maimuru. We'll come back to that one. When Ronald Berndt went to Yirrkala in 46, 47, he collected over 150 bark paintings and objects. He made over 300 drawings. He recorded hours of songs, an entire archive, which is the basis of the Berndt Museum in Perth these days. But the very first object he collected in his registration book, WURMB #1, is the bark painting by Narajan Maimuru. He was also the founding member of the Buku Langai Art Centre when he was really annoyed with the missionaries and set up his own shop on the beach because they weren't giving him enough. His work was set, he was a master artist, and he believed he wasn't being paid appropriately, which is a very common refrain throughout many generations of artists. But just lastly, in relation to the World War II connection to Yirrkala, not all of the bark paintings in that assemblage are actually bark. Plenty of them, probably around 40% of them, are actually on masonite from a decommissioned radar tower. You can actually see this is a door from the radar tower, which was painted by Marwalan Marika, another of the most significant artists at the time. That's the little latch on the bottom of the painting. It's a double-sided painting as well. A very important totemic depiction on there as well. So we looked at these bark paintings from 1946. What I'm just trying to reinforce is they're not historical objects. These were very contemporary artworks at the time and today. And if there's such an important story to be told there of how these people were defending. This is the WURMB number 1. And it's sort of represented in Norforce, the Aboriginal Army unit today. They actually have their own skin name so that people from different clan groups can actually serve together in Norforce in the Aboriginal unit up there. Incredibly proud warriors, defenders of their country. And we need to really, what I was just working with this collection was to try and just bring those important stories to an audience in a way. Well, I wasn't actually. I'll just keep going through a little bit. Because there's also an important issue which is playing out at the moment in relation to the burnt estate and the legacy of the many, many, many important pieces of information relating to many people's history. Ronald Burnt and Catherine Burnt are, I can't say anything good, I can't say anything bad. I find them really complex and profound sort of people. When their embargo is lifted on their research in 2024, I can only think that in the time that when Catherine passed away and she put the embargo on the huge amount of research that they had undertaken in many parts of the country, you have to look at what's happening in 1983. You've got the Farmers Federation, you've got miners' companies putting out these huge scare campaigns against the land rights movement. And to be hugely generous, I think they were trying to protect Aboriginal people. But we all know how that sort of plays out in the long run. When you hear the research that people like Brenda L. Croft have undertaken at the moment and how devastating not being able to access that genealogical information has been to contemporary community members, I just think there's a case for special circumstances to be argued for particular community members who want to access this enormous historical repository of knowledge of the Aboriginal past that people really want to do. So thankfully there's only like a couple more years on that embargo, but I hit that wall numerous times in working with that collection. The 2016 Makarrata that happened in Milingimbi Island was another important aspect that was built into the Jalkaree exhibition, based on the work of John, again, with the Aboriginal Memorial, which is at the entrance to the National Gallery of Australia. Larrakitch. These poles are such a significant way that we need to see. I mean, this was made in the year of the bicentenary. There's a simple explanation. There was one pole for each 200 years of colonisation, and the destruction of Aboriginal graveyards that were happening in different places, in many places all around the country. And so in 2016 though, the Milingimbi people had a really important Makarrata ceremony. A Makarrata in its most simplest sense, that's why it's used in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. A Makarrata is a coming together to air grievances. It's a law court. It's a ceremonial space where people sort out their differences. And in this case, museum representatives from museums across Australia and all around the world were brought to Milingimbi to have a Makarrata ceremony, essentially, and to reset the conversation and to reset the agenda for moving forward. So the ceremonial poles which marked out that Makarrata space for the 2016 Makarrata, which happened in Milingimbi Island, the museum was incredibly fortunate to be able to acquire them and actually use them as the opening threshold of the exhibition Jalkaree. And it was just, we brought down 6 community members. I mean, I volunteered at the ANCAR, Association of Northern and Kimberley Artists, for nearly 3 years. I worked at the Darwin Art Fair. Any opportunity I could get to actually meet artists where they were, where they were working, rather than trying to track down people in their homes in remote communities and things like that, was part of the process, part of the consultation process. It was going to community. It wasn't sort of, expecting community to do any of the work. But we did bring down 6 senior custodians of knowledge from the 3 different regions of the Yolngu country that we worked with, and took them to different places. This is Yalpi at the National Maritime Museum. And look, there's a great publication called Jalkari where you can get a much more deeper understanding of the process. There's actually a couple of videos up on YouTube as well that we produced through Chow Chuak Wing Museum. The very simple process was that the paintings which were acquired by Ronald and Catherine Byrne in 1946-47, there was no curatorial voice in that installation at all. Yalpi and Wannabe very patiently sat with me. We grouped them by language name, by families. We sort of organised it like it was a bungal, like this is where different families would sit in relation to each other at a different ceremony. And look, it wasn't easy. They got very frustrated with me because I was so slow. And we sort of then went back and consulted again. There was like 3 to 4 different layers of consultation that all took place into this show. Visiting other installations. This is the Art Gallery of New South Wales at the top. This is the National Maritime Museum at the bottom with the Gapu monarch saltwater bark paintings, which I probably don't have time to go into tonight, but another foundational counterpoint to the 1946-47 assemblage, which I'm incredibly fortunate to be working with at the moment at the National Maritime Museum. Joe DiMaggi in the bottom corner here, the ceremonial leader from Milingimbi. Incredible man. But the way that we laid them out in that consultation session was pretty well how the final exhibition space for those Yirrkala bark paintings came together. So these are the 10 sort of groups that were grouped together by Yalpi and Wannabe. We even chose masonite to represent the radar tower, which some of the original bark paintings were made from. And, it was a really simple choice for me, but also I copped a little bit of pushback in terms of not exhibiting them on the wall as artworks. But these weren't. These were like literal ancestors of the people that we consulted with. We wanted to show them, as they were coming together in ceremony for a bungal, for example. So I think in the end, the very simple explanation of all this is that the objects curated themselves. There was no need to step in and force things into different ways. Once you actually properly engage with an object and see it as it is, it will tell you where it needs to sit and how it should be exhibited in the most simple sense. And this is looking back against John's remarkable 84 assemblage from Ramingining, including an amazing Lippa Lippa by David Malangi in the centre of the exhibition space, representing the journey between Milingimbi and Ramingining. Anna McCasson's sail represented in there too. Being the foundational exhibition in the Chow Chuak Wing Museum was the temporary exhibition space was an incredible honour. But, as a curator, I didn't do much at all. There was so many other people whose voices we just tried to do justice to allow that to come together. And I think I'll end it at that. That's the book that you can publish. And quickly, that's just the Sea Rights flag, which came out of the saltwater bark paintings and is due to be flown at Navy bases all around the country in the upcoming future, I think. So, thank you very much. I think I've gone way too over time.
Hello, we're on. Okay, so amazing, Matt. That was, really taking us deep into the history of bark painting. Such a generous sharing of your own research and knowledge. Clearly you've been in those archives for a long time. You've pulled up a photo of Vincent also in the course of that presentation, which was terrific to see as well. So I really want to, thank you for sharing that with us. I do want to just ask, we've got time for just a couple of questions. Would anybody like to ask a question while we've got Matt here? You've wowed everybody. Oh, yes, Alice, we've got a couple of questions there. I'll get the mics out. Maybe right off the back.
All criticisms are okay. Sorry, I'm a bit rusty. I haven't spoken to a crowd this big in a long time.
Thank you, Matt. That was really insightful and fascinating to get your weaving together of all those different elements of this story. I was just curious, after discussing Sarah Bennett?
Dorothy Bennett.
Dorothy Bennett, sorry. I was also interested if you had any thoughts on the role of Sandra LeBrun Holmes in that kind of, that process, or that being that kind of intermediary of individuals and their art in that broader sort of world.
No, of course, that's another person I made a bad mistake in leaving out of that story. There's a few really remarkable people in that time period, and Sandra's up there as well. The work that she did with Tom Jawa, for example, I mean, those recordings that she made with Tom Jawa, they're on the golden record on Voyager 1, you know, going through space. I mean, the impact that those people had, you know, and I think a lot of the artists respected that too. You know, that's why they kept going back. You know, I think that's the sign of an art dealer. You know, they weren't carpetbaggers going in there once and not respecting the people that they were working with. They were invited back in many cases. I know the commercial art world is really rough and tumble, but in those golden days, or that golden period, to think of it like that, Sandra, Dorothy, and, you know, a lot of other unnamed Aboriginal people too, which is part of the archival work that I'd really like to see sort of happening. Those who were the brokers, the translators, the people who introduced people to other people. It certainly wasn't a case of just randomly finding amazing artists. You know, there's always a story there, and that really needs to be told. Thanks.
Another question up the back. Is there one? Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I want to ask this question as an Indigenous person. You said something very interesting at the beginning of your lecture, and you sounded sort of uncomfortable with the building of new museums in urban centres while denying funding for cultural activities for Indigenous people in the communities. What do you think is the future of museums with respect to Indigenous culture and material culture, especially in light of current campaigns to repatriate objects?
That's a really awesome question. I mean, I find that debate about, you know, the one National Museum of Aboriginal Australia to be really redundant, because we should just be putting resources into 70 museums across the country and building the resources up of those spaces. You know, when you look at all the art centres which are slowly turning into museums in, you know, remote parts of the country, no one institution can be that one repository of, you know, the Museum of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia. It needs to be distributed and shared amongst the 300 nations across the country, for example. So I hope I'm answering your question, but the more that we boost those resources to museums in every remote and regional museum around the country, the more we create spaces for objects to be repatriated to. And look, I'm a huge supporter of repatriation. I've given back plenty myself, but we also don't want to erase the Aboriginal story from the world stage. I think there is a place for Aboriginal culture to be represented in museums. It's just that we're trying to correct the distorted and imbalanced way that it's been over-authored by non-Indigenous agency in the past. And look, there's no doubt, not just First Nations Australia, but many First Nations around the world are grappling with this issue, and repatriation is the conduit to have that conversation. So it's definitely one of those watch this space areas, because I have seen interesting things coming out of Europe in terms of, you know, the Benin bronzes and things, for example, of not just giving them back, but actually building museums to house those artefacts, because that is often the problem with repatriation. You can't just give something amazing back and someone stores it in their garage. You know, these things are quite fragile materials that if they want to preserve them, and it's totally up to communities if they don't want to preserve them, but it's giving them that choice. And it's a complex process. So, yeah, it just comes down to not relying on volunteers and hardworking people, like I'm sure we all know, who work in the arts industry, to do all the legwork and unpaid legwork themselves. We need to properly recognise the work that people do, preserving and conserving culture, and repatriation plays an important part of that, but it's also the institutions themselves that need to be better resourced. I hope that answered that.
Probably one more question. Any further questions? There's one more over here from Claire.
Thanks. I'm Claire Smith from Archaeology, and I worked very closely with Vince Copley Senior. So it was lovely to see you talking about his stuff. But my question is really around something that I've been working with Vince and with Vince's son, Vince Copley Jr. And what Vinny Jr. says, and this is something we're writing, is what would we do if Aboriginal history was owned by Aboriginal people? So if we're thinking about things like in museums, maybe communities, maybe they lease them. Maybe you pay a lease fee back to communities so that, and you know how little money there is in communities,
Yeah.
Where I work, Barango, Beswick, $228, $243 a week average income. So that those kind of lease fees could be something that could make a great difference to Indigenous poverty.
I think so. The legal ownership is very different from the moral authority in relation to these objects, and anything that sort of gives that moral authority into the future management of these collections back, should definitely be. I've never heard that put like that. That's a really interesting way to think about it. Vinny idea? Okay. I'll look forward to that paper when it comes out.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I think we'll wrap it up there. Matt's obviously written a lot, and the publications that he mentioned, the Jalkaree publication and other papers that are forthcoming, I think everybody should feel inspired to look those up. I certainly will be. So, thanks again, Matt. Really, really fantastic. To wrap up, I just want to acknowledge the team here at Flinders who helped deliver this event, and in particular, I just want to acknowledge Associate Professor and ARC Future Fellow Liam Brady, who's was really a key player in organising this year's event, but hasn't been able to come tonight. As he's a bit of a COVID casualty, but he is definitely here in spirit, and he did a really amazing job. So thank you, Liam. Also, just acknowledging Claire Smith, who just asked that question, because Claire is, of course, apart from being a long-standing academic here, she was the person who pitched the idea of the Megaw lecture in the first place, and was very resourceful in rustling up the funding and pipeline of funding for this event to continue. So thank you, Claire. For tonight's hospitality, I want to thank Serafino Wines, and I think the bar is still open upstairs, so please feel free to have another drink with us. And finally, I want to also put in a plug for FUMA's 2022 exhibition program. You might have seen the little brochures upstairs, so please take one of those. We've got some excellent shows coming up, and we'd love to see you back here again for those. So on that note, thank you all for joining us, and thanks again, Matt.